Make up mine. Fight.
As of right now, Team Fortress 2 received its last major balance patch on March 28, 2018, or close to 7 years ago as I'm recording this. Before that, it received its last major proper content update, Jungle Inferno, on October 20th, 2017. While certain TF2 players are still diligently holding out for that promise but never delivered heavy update, it's unfortunately more likely than not that TF2 will never receive another significant balance patch. Honestly, I'm thankful that the game is still playable and supported at all of these years later, and personally find the state that the game was left in to be mostly fine. There are bugs, wacky balance, and a lot of cosmetic bloat, but the core gameplay integrity is still present and solid, and that's what matters. That said, not every item in the game was left in the best state. Jungle Inferno and Blue Moon saw a host of hefty weapon nerfs that none of us knew at the time would be the states these weapons would be left in virtually forever. If you're a new or prospective TF2 player, you might not even know about these weapons' former glory days. So in this video, I want to discuss what I believe to be the biggest losers of TF2's current, as of right now, final balance state. Weapons that were left at soccer practice by Valve while their friends go to sneak into R-rated movies. The main thing I want to note here is that we are not just discussing bad weapons, but specifically weapons that were nerfed significantly and hung out to dry in TF2's last major balance update. Maybe it'll give you some renewed perspective on these items. All that said, let's roll. Let's start out with one of the most iconic, ubiquitous, and staple weapons of old TF2 that unfortunately hasn't been usable properly in close to a decade, the Sandman. Now, if you weren't around for it, this was one of the most recognizable weapons in the game for a long time. Not only was it one of Scout's first unlockable items, but it was so key to his character that it was even given to his portable Merc figurine, and was also arguably one of the strongest weapons in TF2's history at its peak. This weapon used to inflict a variable amount of complete guaranteed stun on targets who were struck by its ball, stopping them in place and rendering them helpless to follow-up attacks at max range, or putting them into the humiliation state at shorter ranges. There was a ton of emphasis put on this stun effect, with Scout having unique voice lines for it, and several unique mechanics and interactions being designed around it. While this was very powerful and very fun to pull off, it was also inarguably pretty unfun to be on the receiving end of, leading to this weapon's crippling nerf in the Jungle Inferno update. This nerf was a simple one in concept that didn't seem to mean too much at first, yet quickly revealed itself to be absolutely crushing in execution. It removed the Sandman stun effect, instead leaving enemies of the retained ability to fire their weapon, and inducing a few seconds of slowdown on impact with its ball. This was done on top of retaining the weapon's flat -15 max health on wearer, a stat that was present to counteract the utility of being able to completely stun enemies, which is enormously too harsh for what Valve changed this weapon's positive into. This basically made the Sandman go from one of Scout's most ubiquitous commonplace weapons to an arguable bottom 5 weapons in the entire game contender. It's a shame too, because this is one of the game's most staple weapons, and one that prospective new players might not understand the full context of should they unlock it and try it out themselves without knowing its history. While I understand that its old design was definitely a bit much, the patch state that it was left in post Jungle Inferno is arguably too little, and I would have loved to see a compromise somewhere along the way to keep the Sandman just a bit more present in players' minds. Talk about not respecting your elders. And talking about iconic staple Scout weapons that were hung out to dry, we've got the Bonk Atomic Punch. Now, full disclosure, this is one of the better weapons we'll be discussing in this video, as it still retains its core niche of slipping past enemies and distracting sentries especially well. That said, it's also inarguably in the weakest position it's ever been in TF2's current patch state, especially considering that its last update was also the most significant nerf that it ever received. Using the Bonk Atomic Punch renders Scout completely invincible for 8 seconds, at the cost of making him unable to fire his weapon for its effect duration. This makes its intended use case as an infiltration tool that allows Scout to slip past sentries pretty clear. However, it was apparently too clear, as Valve saw fit to add a condition to this effect in Jungle Inferno. Any damage taken while under the Bonk's effects will inflict a variable amount of slowdown to the Scout after its invincibility ends, with the amount going as high as a 50% move speed reduction after consuming more than 200 damage. This is remarkably easy to do, especially in the case of attempting to slip past sentries or a particularly rigid defensive hold, and make Scout just about as vulnerable as he can possibly be under normal gameplay circumstances. Scout's main skill for staying alive is his mobility, and if you're being slowed to half your move speed while being chased by a group of enemies who just saw you slip past their sentry, you're basically a sitting duck once that invuln wears off. Add on to this the fact that the effect duration of the slowdown is always 5 seconds, regardless of how much damage was consumed, and you have a situation where it becomes pretty difficult to stay alive post-bonk. And while I do understand the nerf, as the old free version of the bonk was definitely annoying whenever a Scout managed manage to get behind and spawn camp at no fault of your team, it is most certainly in a weaker position than the weapon has ever been in before. Not the biggest loser of this list, but definitely one that's not operating at peak performance anymore. Moving on to Soldier, he's got a staggering 3 weapons for this list. It's almost like a class being a black sheep of the game's most common competitive lineup would lead to a lot of contentious balance discussions or something. That said, our first choice for him is an interesting one, in that it's a weapon that was purely contentious in specific competitive formats and not at all in most casual ones, the base jumper. This parachute is a funny little guy, primarily because most players unfamiliar with the game's competitive history would not have any reason to think that it ever needed a nerf. It's a parachute for Soldier and Devilman that allows them to lightly float through the air, enhancing their dive bomb potential at the risk of making them easier to smack out of the sky. This is what it's always been for, and most players tend to see it as a harmless gimmick at worst. However, prior to Jungle Inferno, it was even stronger in this intended niche, as it allowed players to redraw and redeploy their parachutes as many times as they'd like during a descent, while also not compromising their air movement. This was fine to most casual players, and added some extra maneuverability to the dive bombing and market gardening playstyles. However, certain portions of the competitive community very vocally did not like it. In 6s specifically, it was cited as throwing off the game's pace, making it difficult for staple precision classes like Demoman, snipers, and enemy soldiers to land air shots, allowing demos and soldiers to remain suspended in the air for entire rounds, and all around impeding on the flow and purity of comp play, leading to the removal of its redeploy feature and halving of its users' air maneuverability. And listen, I was not playing 6's Soldier or Demo at the time that this problem existed, so I can't speak from first-hand experience on how necessary the nerf was, but I do come from a background in fighting games and other highly competitive formats with a history of contentious balance, and I'm aware that the decision to actually nerf this weapon was ultimately on Valve and not the competitive community. Comp players did have issues with it, but Valve were the ones who chose to nerf it. Competitive players are not a scapegoat for unpopular balance decisions. However, if the base jumper truly was such a problem, surely you could have just banned it in 6s, like what usually happens to pretty much every other problem weapon in this regard. The base jumper is in an unfortunate position because it's one of the only examples of a weapon in the game that was specifically problematic in one competitive format and not at all in any other play environment, which is not a healthy state for a weapon to exist in a highly competitive game. A weapon like this is always going to piss someone off, and regardless of where you stand on it, it's most certainly one of TF2's current biggest losers. Onto another multi-class weapon that's usable on Soldier, we have the Reserve Shooter. This is another funny one, as if you're unfamiliar with this weapon's history, you'd probably have no idea that it used to be one of the single most hated items in the game. And to its credit, it's got nothing to do with Soldier. Its niche on him has always remained exactly the same. You pop enemies up with a rocket, switch guns, and reserve shoot them. Short, sweet, and to the point. No, it was this weapon's use case on another class that earned it its former reputation. A use case on a much more controversial class. Yeah, Reserve Shooter Pyro used to be in steady contention for the most despised loadout in the entire game. Basically, prior to Jungle Inferno, air blasting an enemy as Pyro counted as having popped them up for the purposes of the Reserve Shooter's mini crits, allowing for a very easy, cheap, and consistent puff and tap combo where you would press mouse 2, press 2, and press mouse 1. Bada boom, you've confirmed yourself a free kill. When you combine this with the Degreaser's faster weapon switch and some afterburn, you had a recipe for an absolutely despicable Pyro combo on your hands that could easily 1 or 2 tap a lot of the game's classes. For a good while, this was considered the TF2 crutch loadout, a satisfying to pull off, yet an arguably easy and blisteringly effective combo that could carry any Pyro player of any skill level to victory. So, after a few years, Valve took this weapon out back and silently gave it the old Yeller treatment, removing its ability to mini-crit after an air blast from Pyro. This made it pretty much useless on the class, but to be fair, Soldier's usage of it has never changed at all, and it now rests as the ever-present, always the bridesmaid, never the bride of TF2 secondary shotguns. I mean, it could be worse. Oh man, not this guy again. Look, I've already talked about the Righteous Bison 2 or 3 times on this channel, and even if I hadn't, everyone knows of its tragic history at Valve's hands, and just why it's such an unfortunate weapon. Initially used as nothing more than a fringe, if fun, meme and gimmick tool, this weapon was beaten down again and again by Valve for seemingly no reason, consistently nerfing it, lying about its mechanics, changing fundamental principles of its design, and all around leaving it in a worse position than pretty much every other weapon in the game when all said and done. Even in Jungle Inferno, where they claim to have reverted its past nerfs, they were still secretly nerfing it. It's frustrating too, because at literally no level of play or in any play environment was the Righteous Bison ever considered broken, overpowered, or problematic. Pretty much every player always understood it as a silly goof weapon that could occasionally come in clutch, and if it had only received 1 or 2 mechanical nerfs to iron out its more janky aspects, I think it would have been fine. But holy shit, the amount of disrespect and targeted butchering Valve directed at this weapon is unlike anything else I've ever seen in this game. I guess you could say it's a weapon Valve actively hates. Next up, let's talk about a weapon that's near and dear to my heart, despite being borderline unusable these days: Heavy's Eviction Notice. This is another weapon that's in stiff competition as one of the worst items in the game, and it's unfortunate too, because it's only due to its association with another weapon. Prior to Jungle Inferno, this pair of brass knuckles gave Heavy a slight movement speed buff while they were active, swung faster than his default fists, and granted a short speed boost on a successful punch at the cost of dealing less damage than the stock fists, even accounting for the faster swing speed, and making Heavy take slightly more damage while they were active. They were clearly intended as the rush down, pummel your enemy's melee alternative for heavies who wanted to roleplay as their favorite JoJo characters. Unfortunately though, that faster move speed that they happened to boast overlapped pretty heavily with another one of Heavy's key melee weapons in the fast gloves. Due to those being changed to drain Heavy's max health while they were active in Jungle Inferno, Valve saw it fit to do the same thing to the brass knuckles. This was purely done so that both of Heavy's speed boosting weapons had the same downside, and that neither gave their speed boost for free or overlapped with each other. And while the fast gloves made it out of this transition pretty unfazed, the same cannot be said for the much more combat-oriented Eviction Notice. They're basically useless in their core offensive niche now, being too risky to use for combat and being strictly worse than the fast gloves for speed boosting. This doesn't even account for Heavy's other much stronger melee utilities, and it really sucks. These used to be my preferred Heavy melee back before Jungle Inferno, and I would honestly prefer it if Valve removed their passive move speed buff entirely and just left them as the fast-firing, pummel-oriented melee alternative, because even if it wasn't good, it'd still be usable and serve a purpose that wasn't filled better by other options in Heavy's melee slot. Either way, this is a weapon that I used to love, but just can't bring myself to use anymore. I guess you can fucks with the Nux after all. As our penultimate weapon for this video, we have one that was never necessarily good, yet is undoubtedly very fun and BM in the hands of someone who knows how to use it, and used to be even more so: the Sydney Sleeper. Now, let's not mince words. This weapon is objectively pretty bad, even if I find it to be quite fun when used in the right context. Flashing Girardi on your enemies, or just outright one-shotting them with that glorious golden cloud, never stops being satisfying. However, that funny little cloud actually used to serve a much more concrete purpose than it does now. From the Meet Your Match update all the way to the Blue Moon update, fully charged body shots and headshots with this weapon actually applied Girardi in a radius around the intended target, effectively acting as a long-range version of the secondary Girardi signature splash. On top of this, the max duration of the Sydney Sleeper's Girardi effect was capped at 8 seconds rather than 5. This was easily the best state that the weapon ever existed in, and actually allowed it to fill its intended role as a support-oriented debuffing sniper rifle pretty handily. If you could focus on shooting large groups of enemies, you could have a pretty sizable impact on the outcome of a match just by shooting people and splashing their teammates around them. That said, this effect was also pretty frustrating, as it allowed for a sniper to apply a game-changing debuff from behind the comfort of his team at no risk to himself up to 25 times per clip. Due to this, in the Blue Moon update, Valve saw it fit to rework this weapon. And by rework, I mean shoot it in the leg and then put a band-aid on it. This update removed the weapon's Girardi splash effect and cut its minimum effect duration down to 5 seconds, completely gimping its supportive capabilities. But don't worry, Valve also added the Nature's Call mechanic, which reduces your Girardi's cooldown by 1 second every time you land a scoped headshot. And when you consider that Girardi has a 20-second cooldown, and that it takes approximately 2 seconds to line up and fire each scoped headshot, assuming you're hitting each one with perfect timing and accuracy every time, and that the Sydney Sleeper is intended to combo with the Darwin's Danger Shield, and hey, wait a minute, this stat is dog shit. Yeah, the Blue Moon update left the Sydney Sleeper in arguably a worse position than it's ever been in. This update's changes to this item represent a fundamental misunderstanding of its core niche and use, and really shows that Valve was losing touch with balancing the game at this point. I just want to pee on people, man, come on. And lastly is probably the most infamous nerf in TF2's history, at least for the patch state we're currently discussing. It's been described as every spy main's day of mourning, a tragic day that would always be remembered. While for others, it was the Jungle Inferno updates day, for spy mains, it was the Ambassador nerfs day. Now, quick history lesson. The Ambassador used to be the spy gun. It was the definitive best in slot choice for this class's primary, or secondary, I guess, weapon, allowing for flashy skill expression and insane damage for people who could use it well. Boasting ridiculous damage potential from any range thanks to its no fall off crit headshots, it's easy to see why so many players love this weapon. Then, Valve killed it. In Jungle Inferno, citing dissatisfaction with Spy's ability to kill players from across the map, Valve added a unique damage fall-off mechanic to this weapon's crit headshots, making it the only weapon in the game to feature damage fall-off on its critical hits. Its high-skill, high-reward headshots now deal around 54 damage at maximum range, or not even enough to two-shot a light class or even one-shot a kunai spy. This really gimped the item's weapon-defining skill expression and burst damage, and while it is still just as effective at short range, with its classic two-tap combo working just as well, it's inarguably in a worse position overall than it was ever before this. And to an extent, I do understand it, because allowing Spy to effectively one-shot people from long range is kind of silly when he's already capable of backstabs, yet at the same time, I don't know how many Spy mains, outside of cheaters and less honest players, were really taking advantage of the insane long-range damage potential that Valve nerfed this weapon over. All in all, while the Ambassador is still certainly usable, it's also in much harsher contention with the Diamondback as the dedicated crit revolver now, and surely is a far cry from its former glory. Never forget. So, what have we learned? Well, honestly, despite having less than charitable opinions about some of these nerfs, I'm honestly impressed and thankful that the overall balance state of the game isn't worse in general. It's pretty clear that, by the point of these two updates, Valve was losing touch with how to properly balance TF2. So the fact that only a handful of unlocks were left in such a miserable state, and that the overall integrity and game flow of TF2 was still mostly left intact, is very admirable. If a game's not going to receive balance patches anymore, I can see a million alternate timelines where things are way worse. While I may be sad about the base jumper, the Sandman, the eviction notice, or the Sydney sleeper, I'm still glad that Valve took such care and attention to leaving the game in a relatively healthy state. All in all, could be better, but could certainly be a lot worse. But they didn't nerf the vaccinator, so bad. Either way, thanks, hope y'all had a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers!